The great assembly hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal, its transparent walls offering a breathtaking view of the twin stars that illuminated the Nexus station. Representatives from 417 different species occupied floating platforms arranged in concentric circles, each delegation positioned according to their civilization's age and perceived importance in galactic affairs. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat in the outermost ring, representing humanity's newest membership in the Council. The human delegation consisted of only 3 individuals, a laughably small number compared to the massive entourages that surrounded the elder species. The Zephyrians alone had brought 47 representatives, their crystalline bodies refracting the starlight into rainbow patterns across the chamber floor. "The newest species always sit in the cheap seats," muttered Dr. Marcus Webb, humanity's chief xenobiologist, as he adjusted his translation earpiece. "They make it pretty clear where we stand in the pecking order." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the obvious slight. Humanity had been granted membership in the Galactic Council only 6 months ago, after first contact protocols had been established with a correlation exploration vessel. The process had been swift by galactic standards, though painfully slow for humans accustomed to rapid decision-making. The Council's current session focused on trade regulations and resource allocation, topics that typically generated hours of careful debate among species that measured their civilizations in millennia. Sarah had attended enough sessions to understand the unspoken hierarchy that governed every interaction. Ancient species like the Ethereals and the Vorthan Empire commanded immediate respect, their words carrying weight accumulated over millions of years of galactic presence. Younger species, particularly those like humanity with less than 50,000 years of space travel, were expected to observe and learn. Speaking out of turn was considered the height of rudeness, and challenging the established order was simply unthinkable. Prime Counselor Vexai, a towering Zephyrian whose crystalline form had survived for over 12,000 years, called for attention with a harmonic chime that resonated through the chamber's acoustic systems. "We now address the matter of territorial disputes in the Outer Rim sectors," his translated voice announced. "Several mining rights conflicts require immediate arbitration." Sarah leaned forward slightly. The Outer Rim territories included systems that bordered human space, making this discussion directly relevant to Earth's interests. She had hoped to present humanity's perspective on peaceful resource sharing, but junior members were rarely invited to participate in substantive debates. The discussion that followed revealed the Council's standard approach to conflict resolution. Elder species would divide contested territories among themselves, often leaving younger civilizations with whatever scraps remained. The process was presented as fair and orderly, but Sarah recognized it as little more than sophisticated bullying disguised as diplomatic procedure. "The hegemony claims mining rights to 17 systems in Sector 7, announced Ambassador Korthnex, representing a species that resembled oversized mantises. "Our archaeological surveys prove our ancestors visited these worlds over 2 million years ago." Murmurs of approval rippled through the elder delegations. Ancient claims carried enormous weight in council deliberations, even when those claims were based on minimal evidence. Sarah had reviewed the hegemony's survey data and found it questionable at best, but challenging their interpretation would be seen as an insult to millions of years of accumulated wisdom. The Vorthan representative, a slug-like creature whose cybernetic enhancements gleamed in the starlight, projected a holographic display showing territorial boundaries. "The hegemony's historical precedent is well established," the translator rendered its wet, bubbling speech. "However, we must also consider the collective's prior arrangements with local populations." Sarah exchanged glances with Dr. Webb. The local populations being discussed included 3 human colonies that had been established in good faith, following all known protocols for territorial expansion. The colonists had invested years of their lives building communities on worlds they believed were unclaimed, only to discover that galactic law recognized claims dating back millions of years. As the debate continued, it became clear that humanity's colonies would be forcibly relocated to make room for the elder species' mining operations. The decision was presented as a minor administrative matter, hardly worth extended discussion. After all, humans were newcomers to galactic civilization, and their needs naturally took secondary priority to established powers. Perhaps the human delegation would benefit from observing this process, suggested Prime Counselor Vexai, his tone carrying the condescending patience typically reserved for children. Understanding proper territorial protocols will help prevent future misunderstandings. Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she maintained diplomatic composure. The Prime Counselor's words were carefully chosen to remind everyone present of humanity's junior status. They weren't being consulted about decisions affecting their own people. They were being educated about how the galaxy really worked. Dr. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As a scientist, he had initially been excited about joining a galactic community of knowledge and cooperation. The reality had proven far more disappointing, as it became clear that the Council operated more like an exclusive club than a democratic assembly. The territorial redistribution proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Systems were reassigned, populations were scheduled for relocation, and mining rights were allocated according to complex formulas that heavily favored civilizations with longer histories. Human colonies received brief mentions as logistical concerns to be addressed during the transition period. The implementation timeline allows 60 standard days for population transfers, announced the Vorthan representative. This should provide adequate time for newer species to adjust their territorial claims accordingly. 60 days to uproot entire communities. Sarah calculated the logistics in her head and realized the timeline was completely inadequate for safe evacuation of over 40,000 colonists. The elder species clearly expected humans to prioritize speed over safety, accepting whatever losses occurred as the natural cost of challenging galactic hierarchy. "Excuse me," Sarah said, rising from her seat. The unexpected interruption caused a ripple of surprise through the chamber. Junior species representatives typically remained silent during territorial discussions. Prime Counselor Vexai's crystalline form shifted slightly, refracting light in patterns that the translation system interpreted as mild annoyance. "The human delegation wishes to make an observation." "We request additional time for civilian evacuation," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. 60 days is insufficient for safe relocation of our colonial populations." A sound that might have been laughter emerged from several elder delegations. The concept of prioritizing individual safety over administrative efficiency clearly struck them as naive and impractical. "The timeline has been carefully calculated based on standard evacuation procedures," responded Ambassador Korthnex. "Perhaps humanity requires additional education regarding proper colonial management techniques." The dismissive tone sparked something dangerous in Sarah's chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Losing her temper would only confirm every negative stereotype about young, emotional species. Instead, she reached for the data pad containing detailed evacuation analyses. "Our calculations show that safe evacuation requires minimum 120 days, she continued. "We have detailed medical data proving that rushed relocations result in significant casualties among vulnerable populations." "Casualties are regrettable but inevitable," the Vorthan representative replied with mechanical indifference. "The needs of galactic commerce must take priority over individual concerns." Dr. Webb stood up beside Sarah, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "Individual concerns? We're talking about the lives of 40,000 people, including children and elderly colonists who have spent decades building these communities." The chamber fell silent. Direct emotional appeals were considered primitive behavior, evidence of a species' inability to think in properly civilized terms. Several elder representatives began displaying physiological signs of distaste, their various forms of body language conveying disapproval. "The human delegation appears to misunderstand the nature of galactic governance," Prime Counselor Vexai observed. "Personal attachments to individual welfare must be subordinated to larger considerations of order and stability." Sarah felt something cold and sharp crystallizing in her mind. She had spent months trying to understand the Council's decision-making processes, hoping to find common ground between human values and galactic civilization. Now she realized the fundamental disconnect wasn't a matter of miscommunication or cultural differences. The elder species genuinely viewed individual lives as expendable resources, meaningful only in aggregate numbers. Their millions of years of civilization had stripped away any concept of personal value, reducing sentient beings to statistical entries in vast administrative calculations. "I see," Sarah said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying the Council's position." She sat down, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. Dr. Webb remained standing for a moment longer, clearly struggling with his own realization of what they were dealing with. When he finally resumed his seat, his hands were shaking slightly. The territorial discussion continued as if the interruption had never occurred. Mining rights were finalized, relocation schedules were confirmed, and administrative details were delegated to various bureaucratic departments. The 40,000 human colonists had become a minor footnote in a larger economic arrangement. As the session progressed, Sarah found herself studying the elder representatives with new eyes. These weren't wise, ancient beings whose counsel deserved respect. They were predators who had learned to disguise their nature behind elaborate protocols and civilized rhetoric. The hegemony's archaeological claims were obvious fabrications, but challenging them was pointless because truth mattered less than power. The Vorthan efficiency calculations ignored human physiology because alien lives were irrelevant to their planning process. The Council's democratic structure was a carefully maintained illusion that disguised what was fundamentally a system of organized exploitation. "We should probably start preparing evacuation recommendations," Dr. Webb whispered. "Maybe we can minimize the casualties if we plan carefully." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on a different kind of planning. The Council operated under the assumption that younger species would accept whatever treatment they received, too weak and inexperienced to challenge established authority. They had built their entire system around the premise that might makes right, disguised as respectability. But they had made one critical error in their assessment of humanity. They assumed that because humans were newcomers to galactic civilization, they would naturally accept subordinate status. They had confused inexperience with helplessness, and that confusion was about to prove costly. As the session drew to a close, Prime Counselor Vexhai offered a final patronizing comment. "The Council appreciates humanity's participation in these proceedings. Observing proper territorial protocols will help integrate your species more effectively into galactic society." "Thank you for the education," Sarah replied politely. "It's been very illuminating." The double meaning was lost on the elder representatives, who interpreted her words as appropriate gratitude for their wisdom. They had no way of knowing that Ambassador Sarah Chen had spent 15 years in Earth's military intelligence service before transitioning to diplomatic roles, or that her careful observations had been building a comprehensive assessment of the Council's actual power structure. They also had no idea that Dr. Marcus Webb's xenobiology credentials included extensive research on predator-prey relationships across multiple ecosystems. His scientific mind was already analyzing the behavioral patterns he had observed, identifying vulnerabilities in what appeared to be an invincible system. As the representatives began filing out of the chamber, Sarah activated her personal communicator and sent a coded message to Earth. The message was brief and seemingly routine, a standard diplomatic report on the day's proceedings. But buried within the formal language was a request for immediate consultation with Earth's Defense Council. The elder species had just made it clear that they viewed humanity as prey. They had centuries of experience crushing younger civilizations that dared to challenge their authority, and they expected this case to follow the same predictable pattern. What they didn't understand was that humans were not prey animals. Humanity had clawed its way to the top of Earth's food chain through persistence, adaptability, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Those same traits that had made them successful predators on their home world were about to be unleashed on a galactic scale. The Council session had ended with what the elder species believed was a routine administrative victory. In reality, it had triggered something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. They had awakened humanity's predator instincts, and the consequences would reshape the entire galaxy. The emergency session of Earth's Defense Council convened 18 hours after Sarah's coded transmission reached Geneva. Admiral Rebecca Morrison studied the holographic display showing human colonies scattered across the outer rim, each one now marked in red to indicate forced evacuation status. The numbers were stark and uncompromising: 43,000 colonists, 60 days to evacuate, and transportation capacity for maybe half that number in the allotted timeframe. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, General Hassan al-Rashid observed, his weathered face grim as he reviewed the Council's territorial redistribution documents. This is systematic dispossession disguised as administrative procedure. Sarah's image flickered in the center of the room, transmitted from the Nexus station through quantum entanglement communicators. Despite the incredible distance, her expression of controlled fury came through clearly. The elder species have done this hundreds of times before. They identify promising territories claimed by younger civilizations, fabricate historical precedents, and use the Council's legal framework to legitimize theft. Defense Minister Yuki Tanaka leaned forward, studying casualty projections on her personal display. How many times have they forced relocations like this? According to the archives I could access, the hegemony has reclaimed territories from 17 different species over the past 50,000 years. Dr. Webb's voice joined the conversation as his image appeared alongside Sarah's. The pattern is always identical: archaeological claims, rushed evacuation timelines, and accepting whatever casualties occur as unavoidable administrative costs. Admiral Morrison felt a familiar cold anger settling in her chest, the same emotion that had sustained her through 3 decades of protecting Earth from various threats. But this situation was different from anything humanity had faced before. Previous enemies had been obviously hostile, making their intentions clear through direct aggression. The Galactic Council presented a more insidious challenge: predators who had learned to hunt using law and custom rather than weapons and violence. What happened to the other species who lost territory this way? She asked. Sarah's expression darkened. Most of them eventually abandoned their colonial programs entirely. The forced relocations are deliberately traumatic, designed to discourage further expansion attempts. Species that resist face escalating pressure until they either submit completely or get expelled from the Council altogether. And expulsion means what exactly? Complete isolation from galactic commerce, technology exchange, and diplomatic protection, Dr. Webb explained. Species that get blacklisted become targets for any predator civilization that wants easy conquests. The Council doesn't have to destroy resistant species directly. They just remove protection and let nature take its course. General al-Rashid pulled up tactical assessments on his display, studying force projections and strategic capabilities. His military mind automatically began calculating odds and analyzing options. What kind of enforcement mechanisms does the Council actually have? That's the interesting part, Sarah replied. Their system depends entirely on voluntary compliance backed by economic pressure. They don't maintain a centralized military force because they've never needed one. Every younger species eventually submits rather than face isolation and predation. Admiral Morrison's strategic experience immediately identified the critical weakness in that approach. Organizations that relied solely on intimidation and economic coercion were vulnerable to opponents willing to accept short-term costs for long-term advantages. The Council had built their entire power structure around the assumption that rational actors would always choose immediate survival over principled resistance. Have any species ever fought back successfully? Not according to available records, Dr. Webb admitted. But the historical data might be incomplete. The Council controls information flow, and they have strong incentives to suppress stories about successful resistance. Defense Minister Tanaka studied population distribution charts, calculating logistics and resource requirements. Evacuating 43,000 people safely would require at least 200 transport ships and 4 months minimum timeline. We have maybe 30 ships available, and the Council's deadline gives us 60 days. The mathematics were brutally simple. Attempting to meet the Council's evacuation timeline would result in thousands of preventable deaths, while requesting additional time would be dismissed as evidence of humanity's administrative incompetence. The elder species had carefully designed their system to ensure that younger civilizations faced impossible choices, guaranteeing failure regardless of which option they selected. They expect us to choose between accepting massive casualties or formally requesting deadline extensions that they'll refuse, Admiral Morrison observed. Either choice establishes precedent for future exploitation. Sarah nodded grimly. The Council specializes in creating no-win scenarios. They've had millions of years to perfect techniques for breaking resistant species without obvious coercion. General al-Rashid highlighted specific colony locations on the tactical display, noting defensive positions and strategic resources. His analysis revealed something interesting about the territories being seized. The systems targeted by the hegemony contained unusually rich deposits of rare minerals essential for advanced manufacturing, and their positions provided strategic control over several important trade routes. "This isn't random predation," he concluded. "They've specifically targeted our most valuable colonies and our best strategic positions. Someone conducted detailed intelligence gathering before initiating this territorial grab." The implication was sobering. The Council's actions weren't merely opportunistic exploitation of a weaker species. They represented a calculated attempt to cripple humanity's long-term expansion potential. By seizing the most valuable human territories and establishing precedent for future seizures, the elder species were ensuring that humanity would never accumulate enough resources to challenge their dominance. "We need to consider response options," Admiral Morrison stated. "What are our alternatives to accepting their terms?" Defense Minister Tanaka pulled up economic projections showing the costs of various resistance scenarios. Direct military confrontation is obviously impossible. The elder species have technological advantages accumulated over millions of years, and their combined industrial capacity dwarfs our entire civilization. "What about asymmetric approaches?" Sarah's expression shifted slightly, revealing the intelligence analyst beneath her diplomatic facade. "The Council's power structure has some interesting vulnerabilities. Their authority depends on maintaining an image of invincible competence, but their system is actually quite brittle. They've never faced organized resistance from multiple species simultaneously." Dr. Webb's scientific mind immediately grasped the implications. Predator-prey relationships in complex ecosystems often involve cascade effects. If prey species begin coordinating defensive strategies, even dominant predators can find themselves overwhelmed. Admiral Morrison felt pieces of a strategy beginning to coalesce. Her decades of military experience had taught her that apparently invincible enemies often possessed critical weaknesses that became obvious only when approached from unexpected directions. The Council had designed their system to handle individual species challenging their authority, but they might be unprepared for more sophisticated opposition. "What other species are currently facing territorial pressures?" "The Kepler Federation is dealing with similar mining rights disputes," Sarah reported. "The Centauri Alliance just lost 3 systems to archaeological claims, and the Rigel Consortium is facing forced population relocations in the Inner Rim sectors." "All within the past standard year," Dr. Webb added. "The elder species appear to be accelerating their territorial acquisition programs. Either they're responding to some internal pressure, or they've identified a window of opportunity they want to exploit." General al-Rashid studied the pattern of territorial seizures, noting timing and strategic significance. "This looks like preparation for something larger. They're not just grabbing random territories, they're systematically securing key positions and resources across multiple sectors." The implications were ominous. If the elder species were preparing for some kind of major expansion or conflict, they would want to eliminate potential resistance from younger civilizations before beginning their primary operations. The current wave of territorial seizures might represent the opening phase of a much larger campaign. "We need intelligence on their ultimate objectives," Admiral Morrison decided. "And we need to establish contact with other affected species. If they're targeting multiple civilizations simultaneously, we might have more potential allies than we realized." Sarah's diplomatic training immediately identified the challenges involved. The Council monitors all communications between member species. Any attempt to coordinate resistance would be detected and used as justification for immediate expulsion. "Then we'll have to be clever about it," Defense Minister Tanaka observed. "Intelligence services have methods for covert communication that even advanced civilizations might not anticipate." Dr. Webb's xenobiology expertise suggested another approach. Scientific conferences and academic exchanges are considered routine diplomatic activities. The Council encourages knowledge sharing between species, and they probably don't monitor scientific communications as closely as political discussions. Admiral Morrison recognized the potential for building a resistance network disguised as academic cooperation. Intelligence operatives had often used scholarly conferences as cover for sensitive meetings, and the same techniques could work on a galactic scale. We need a two-track approach, she decided. Public compliance with council directives while we build covert relationships with other affected species. If we can establish communication channels, we might discover that we're not as isolated as the council wants us to believe. The strategy was risky and complex, requiring careful coordination between multiple agencies and extensive resources. But the alternative was accepting permanent subordination to predatory civilizations that viewed human lives as expendable resources. "What about our colonists in the meantime?" General al-Rashid asked. "We can't leave 43,000 people hanging while we build resistance networks." Sarah's expression hardened with determination. "We begin evacuation preparations immediately, but we do it our way rather than following their timeline. If we can't meet their 60-day deadline safely, we'll miss it deliberately and see how they respond." The proposal was audacious and dangerous. Deliberately defying a council directive would trigger immediate consequences, possibly including expulsion from galactic civilization. But it would also force the elder species to reveal their actual enforcement mechanisms, providing valuable intelligence about their capabilities and limitations. "You're talking about using our own people as bait," Defense Minister Tanaka observed. "I'm talking about refusing to participate in their manufactured crisis," Sarah replied firmly. "The Council created this situation specifically to force us into impossible choices. The only way to break their pattern is to refuse to play their game according to their rules." Admiral Morrison understood the logic, but she also understood the human cost. If the resistance strategy failed, the consequences would fall on ordinary colonists who had never chosen to become pawns in a galactic power struggle. The decision required accepting responsibility for thousands of lives based on calculations about alien psychology and political systems. But the alternative was accepting a future where humanity remained permanently subordinate to species that viewed them as expendable resources. Every precedent established now would define the terms of human existence for generations to come. "We proceed with both tracks simultaneously," she decided. "Begin covert outreach to potential allies while preparing for extended colonial evacuation timelines. If the Council wants to escalate, we'll discover exactly what their threats are worth." The meeting concluded with detailed assignments and coordination protocols. Within hours, coded messages would begin reaching Earth's most experienced intelligence operatives and xenobiology researchers, initiating contact protocols with other species facing Council pressure. Sarah's transmission ended with a final observation that crystallized the challenge they faced. The elder species have forgotten something important about predator-prey relationships. Sometimes the prey evolves faster than the predator expects, and when that happens, the entire food chain can shift very quickly. Admiral Morrison stared at the tactical displays long after the connection ended, studying patterns and possibilities. Humanity was about to discover whether their reputation for adaptability and persistence was more than just species pride. The Council had spent millions of years perfecting techniques for dominating younger civilizations, but they had never faced a species that had evolved specifically to hunt the hunters. The real test was about to begin. Dr. Elena Vasquez adjusted her academic robes as she entered the Grand Symposium Hall on Kepler Station, her credentials identifying her as Earth's representative to the Interspecies Conference on Xenobiology and Evolutionary Dynamics. The conference attracted researchers from dozens of civilizations, making it perfect cover for the kind of conversations that would trigger immediate council surveillance if conducted through diplomatic channels. 3 weeks had passed since Earth's Defense Council authorized covert outreach to other species facing territorial pressures from elder civilizations. The academic conference provided an ideal opportunity to establish contact without arousing suspicion, but Alina knew she was walking a dangerous line between scientific discussion and seditious conspiracy. The symposium's opening presentations focused on comparative evolutionary biology, with researchers sharing data about adaptation strategies across different worlds and environmental conditions. Alina found herself genuinely fascinated by studies of convergent evolution that had produced similar survival mechanisms in completely unrelated species, separated by thousands of light years. During a break between sessions, she approached Dr. Kefler, a Kepler Federation scientist whose research on pack hunting behaviors had earned galactic recognition. The mantis-like alien was examining holographic displays of predator coordination patterns when Alina introduced herself. "Your work on collective intelligence in hunting strategies is remarkable," she began, using carefully neutral academic language. "I'm particularly interested in how environmental pressures affect pack coordination when facing larger predators." Dr. Kefler's compound eyes focused on Alina with sharp intelligence. "Environmental pressures often reveal hidden capabilities," he replied, his translator rendering clicks and chirps into precise words. "Species that appear weak individually sometimes demonstrate surprising effectiveness when circumstances force them to cooperate." The conversation continued for several minutes, ostensibly focused on theoretical research while actually establishing mutual understanding of their shared situation. Dr. Kefler's species was facing similar territorial pressures from the hegemony, with 3 of their most productive worlds scheduled for archaeological reclamation within the next standard year. "Perhaps we could collaborate on a comparative study," Alina suggested. "Examining how different species respond to similar environmental challenges might yield interesting insights." "I would be very interested in such research," Dr. Kefler agreed. "My laboratory facilities are available for joint projects that might benefit both our civilizations." They exchanged contact information using standard academic protocols, but Alina noted the subtle emphasis Dr. Kefler placed on certain phrases. He was definitely interested in more than theoretical research, and his references to laboratory facilities suggested access to secure communication channels. Similar conversations occurred throughout the conference as Alina identified researchers from species experiencing council pressure. Dr. Zhexhai from the Centauri Alliance discussed defensive symbiosis in threatened ecosystems. Professor Mordun from the Rigel Consortium explored adaptation mechanisms in rapidly changing environments. Each conversation followed the same careful pattern, academic interest masking political necessity. By the conference's 3rd day, Alina had established contact with representatives from 7 different species, all facing various forms of territorial or economic pressure from elder civilizations. The pattern was even more extensive than Earth's intelligence services had realized, encompassing nearly every younger species that had achieved interstellar expansion in the past 100,000 years. The breakthrough came during a panel discussion on predator-prey dynamics in complex ecosystems. Dr. Kefler presented research showing how small predator species could coordinate to overwhelm much larger opponents through synchronized tactics and shared intelligence. His examples came from his homeworld's evolution, but the implications for their current situation were unmistakable. "Interesting parallels exist in non-biological systems," Alina observed during the question period. "Administrative and economic structures often exhibit similar dynamics, with smaller entities finding innovative approaches to challenges that appear insurmountable." Professor Mordun joined the discussion. "Collaborative resistance strategies sometimes emerge naturally when environmental pressures become too severe for individual adaptation. The key factor appears to be communication channels that allow coordination without alerting dominant predators to changing prey behavior." Alina felt excitement building as she realized the scope of potential cooperation. These weren't just isolated civilizations facing similar problems. They were a network of intelligent species who had independently reached the same conclusions about the Council's predatory nature. "Perhaps we should establish a formal research consortium," Dr. Zhexhai suggested. "Joint studies on environmental adaptation could benefit all participating civilizations." The academic framework provided perfect cover for regular communication and resource sharing. Research collaborations were encouraged by the Council as evidence of peaceful cooperation between species, and scientific data exchanges were subject to minimal surveillance compared to diplomatic communications. Alina activated her personal communicator and sent a coded message to Earth. "Conference extremely productive. Have identified extensive research opportunities with multiple academic institutions. Recommend establishing formal consortium for long-term collaborative studies." Admiral Morrison's response came through quantum entanglement channels within hours. "Approved. Establish whatever academic relationships necessary for comprehensive research program. The consortium's first formal meeting took place in Dr. Kepler's laboratory complex on Kepler Station. Security was provided by the station's standard academic privacy protocols, which prevented surveillance of proprietary research discussions. 7 species were represented, each bringing intelligence about council enforcement mechanisms and territorial expansion patterns. The scope is larger than any of us realized, Dr. HFY reported, displaying a holographic map showing territorial seizures across multiple galactic sectors. Elder species have targeted 47 younger civilizations for various forms of territorial acquisition within the past 5 years. Professor Mordun highlighted economic pressure campaigns affecting another 30 species. They're not just grabbing territory directly. The Council uses trade restrictions, technology embargoes, and diplomatic isolation to force civilizations into accepting unfavorable resource agreements. Alina studied the data, recognizing patterns that Earth's analysts had missed. This isn't opportunistic exploitation. They're implementing a coordinated strategy to prevent any younger species from accumulating enough resources to challenge their dominance. The implications were staggering. The elder species weren't just responding to individual territorial disputes. They were conducting a systematic campaign to maintain permanent control over galactic civilization. Every younger species was being carefully managed to ensure they remained dependent on Council approval for survival. My species has faced 3 separate territorial challenges in the past decade, Dr. Kepler observed. Each time, we've been forced to relocate populations and abandon valuable infrastructure. The cumulative effect is making it impossible to maintain consistent development programs. Similar stories emerged from every representative. The Council had perfected techniques for applying just enough pressure to prevent growth without triggering desperate resistance. They kept younger species perpetually off balance, never allowing them to achieve the stability necessary for major technological or territorial advances. The question is whether coordinated resistance is actually possible, Alina stated. Individual species can't challenge the Council directly, but a coalition might have different options. Professor Mordun accessed classified data from his government's intelligence services. My people have analyzed the Council's actual military capabilities. The elder species maintain impressive defensive forces, but they have limited expeditionary capacity for simultaneous operations across multiple sectors. Dr. HFY confirmed similar assessments from Centauri Alliance analysts. They depend on psychological intimidation backed by selective demonstrations of force. If multiple species resisted simultaneously, they couldn't respond effectively to all challenges. Alina felt pieces of a larger strategy beginning to emerge. The Council's power depended on maintaining an image of invincible authority, but their actual enforcement capabilities were more limited than they wanted younger species to believe. "What kind of resistance are we talking about?" she asked. "Direct military confrontation would be suicide, even with coalition support. Economic and logistical disruption might be more effective," Dr. Kepler suggested. "The elder species depend on resources and manufactured goods from younger civilizations more than they want to admit. Coordinated trade restrictions could create serious pressure." Professor Mordun pulled up supply chain analyses showing resource flows between different species. The Council's economy depends on a complex network of interdependent relationships. Disrupting key nodes could have cascade effects throughout their entire system. Alina recognized the potential for asymmetric warfare adapted to galactic scales. Younger species couldn't match the Council's technological advantages, but they could exploit vulnerabilities in economic and logistical networks that had evolved to assume compliance from subordinate civilizations. "We would need precise coordination and extensive intelligence sharing," she observed. "One species acting alone would be crushed immediately, but simultaneous resistance from multiple civilizations might overwhelm their response capabilities." The consortium spent the next several hours developing preliminary coordination protocols. Each species would maintain normal diplomatic relations with the Council while secretly preparing resistance capabilities. When the time came for coordinated action, they would have infrastructure in place for economic disruption, communication networks, and mutual support systems. "The risk is enormous," Dr. HFY warned. If the Council discovers our coordination before we're ready to act, they'll move to isolate and destroy each of our civilizations individually. Alina understood the stakes, but she also understood the alternative. Accepting permanent subordination would condemn humanity and every other younger species to existence as managed resources for elder civilizations. The choice was between risking everything for freedom or accepting gradual extinction as independent cultures. My government is already committed to this path, she announced. We're prepared to miss the evacuation deadline for our colonies and accept whatever consequences follow. If other species are willing to coordinate resistance, we can move beyond individual defiance to collective action. The consortium's final session established encrypted communication protocols and resource-sharing agreements. Each species would contribute intelligence, economic analysis, and strategic capabilities to the collective resistance effort. More importantly, they would coordinate their individual acts of defiance to create maximum psychological impact on Council authority. As the academic conference concluded, Alina transmitted her final report to Earth. Research consortium established successfully. Collaborative studies will produce significant results within the next standard year. Recommend immediate preparation for comprehensive field testing of theoretical models. Admiral Morrison's response was characteristically direct. Understood, beginning operational preparations immediately. Alina departed Kepler Station knowing that humanity was no longer isolated in their resistance to Council predation. 7 species had committed to coordinated defiance, and preliminary intelligence suggested that dozens more might join once the initial resistance proved viable. The elder species had designed their system around the assumption that younger civilizations would never achieve effective cooperation. They had built elaborate mechanisms for preventing individual species from accumulating power, while ignoring the possibility that multiple species might share resources and coordinate strategies. That oversight was about to become the foundation of their downfall. Humanity's predator instincts were awakening, but they weren't awakening alone. An entire coalition of younger species was discovering that they were stronger together than any of them could be individually. The Council was about to learn that evolution never stops, and sometimes the prey evolves faster than the predator anticipates. When that happens, the entire ecosystem changes very quickly, and species that seemed permanently dominant can find themselves facing extinction with shocking suddenness. The real test would come when the evacuation deadline expired and humanity's colonies remained exactly where they were, protected not by individual defiance, but by collective resistance from species that had finally learned to hunt the hunters. The evacuation deadline expired at 14:00 Galactic Standard Time on a Tuesday that would reshape interstellar civilization. In the Outer Rim territories, 43,000 human colonists continued their daily routines on worlds that the Galactic Council had declared forfeit to the hegemony. Children attended school, farmers tended crops, and engineers maintained infrastructure systems as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat in the same crystal assembly hall where humanity's subordinate status had been so casually demonstrated 3 months earlier. The chamber buzzed with confused energy as representatives from elder species tried to understand why their routine territorial acquisition had encountered unprecedented resistance. Prime Counselor Vexhi's crystalline form refracting agitation patterns as he called for emergency session protocols. The human delegation will explain their species' failure to comply with established relocation timelines. His translated voice carried carefully controlled anger. Sarah rose from humanity's position in the outer ring, but this time she wasn't alone. Dr. Kepler from the Kepler Federation stood simultaneously, followed by representatives from the Centauri Alliance, the Rigel Consortium, and 4 other civilizations. The coordinated action sent ripples of surprise through the elder delegations. The human colonies remain in position because forced evacuation under impossible timelines constitutes a violation of basic sentient rights, Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. We will not participate in administrative procedures designed to cause preventable casualties. Ambassador Korthnex's mantis-like form clicked with irritation. The timeline was calculated using standard evacuation protocols. Failure to comply indicates administrative incompetence requiring council intervention. The timeline was calculated to ensure casualties, Dr. Kefler interjected, his compound eyes reflecting light in patterns the translation systems rendered as stern determination. The Kepler Federation's analysis confirms that safe evacuation requires minimum 4 months for human colonial populations. Murmurs of confusion spread through the elder delegations. Junior species weren't supposed to possess independent analytical capabilities, and they certainly weren't supposed to coordinate resistance to council directives. The situation was unprecedented in millions of years of galactic governance. The Vorthan representative projected diplomatic protocols onto the chamber's central display. Territorial redistribution follows established legal frameworks developed over 2 million years of galactic civilization. Archaeological precedence validates hegemony claims to the disputed systems. Archaeological precedence based on fabricated evidence, the Centauri Alliance representative stated flatly. Our Xenoarchaeology department has reviewed the hegemony's survey data and identified 14 distinct falsification techniques. The chamber fell silent. Direct accusations of fraud against elder species violated every protocol of civilized discourse. Such statements would normally result in immediate expulsion from the council, but the coordinated nature of the resistance created a different dynamic. Sarah activated a holographic display showing detailed analysis of the hegemony's territorial claims. Independent verification reveals that alleged archaeological sites contain manufactured artifacts placed within the past 50 standard years. The materials analysis shows isotopic signatures inconsistent with claimed dates. Prime Counselor Vexhi's crystalline structure shifted to frequencies the translation system interpreted as shock and outrage. The human delegation accuses a founding species of criminal deception. Such allegations require immediate censure and disciplinary action. The evidence speaks for itself, Professor Mordun from the Rigel Consortium replied, transmitting additional forensic data to the Chamber's information systems. Scientific analysis supersedes political considerations when evaluating factual claims. Dr. Webb's voice joined the discussion from his position in the human delegation. Archaeological fraud is well documented in the galactic record. The hegemony has used identical fabrication techniques against 17 different species over the past 50,000 years. The elder species found themselves confronting something they had never experienced: coordinated intellectual resistance backed by scientific evidence and shared intelligence. Individual species challenging their authority could be dismissed as naive or incompetent, but multiple civilizations presenting unified analysis was a different problem entirely. Ambassador Korthnex attempted to regain control of the situation. Regardless of archaeological interpretations, the Council's territorial authority supersedes individual species' preferences. Compliance with relocation directives is mandatory under galactic law. Galactic law derived from coercive frameworks designed to perpetuate elder species dominance, Sarah replied, accessing legal analysis prepared by the Resistance Consortium. The foundational principles of the Council Charter guarantee territorial sovereignty and protection from arbitrary seizure. She projected the original charter documents, highlighting provisions that the elder species had systematically ignored for millions of years. The legal framework actually provided extensive protection for younger civilizations, but those protections had been buried under layers of accumulated precedent and administrative interpretation. Charter provisions apply to species capable of exercising responsible sovereignty, the Vorthan representative stated. Younger civilizations require guidance until they achieve sufficient maturity for independent governance. Maturity defined by compliance with elder species preferences, Dr. Kefler observed. Coincidentally, no younger species has ever been judged mature enough to qualify for charter protections. The exchange revealed the Council's fundamental contradiction. They claimed to operate under legal principles while systematically violating those principles to maintain power. The elder species had become so accustomed to unchallenged authority that they had forgotten their own system's theoretical foundations. The Charter requires evidence of civilizational stability and responsible resource management, Prime Counselor Vexhi explained, his tone suggesting infinite patience with ignorant children. Species that challenge established authority demonstrate precisely the kind of instability that justifies continued supervision. Sarah felt something cold and dangerous crystallizing in her mind. The Council's position was perfectly circular. They would grant independence to species that never challenged their authority, but challenging their authority proved unfitness for independence. It was a system designed to perpetuate itself regardless of justice or legal principle. "I see," she said quietly. "So the Charter protections are theoretical constructs that can never be practically applied." "The protections apply when species demonstrate readiness," Vexhai replied with condescending patience. "And readiness is demonstrated by accepting whatever treatment elder species choose to impose. Readiness is demonstrated by understanding proper galactic order." Sarah exchanged glances with the other resistance representatives. They had forced the Council to articulate their actual position. Younger species existed to serve elder civilizations, and any resistance to that arrangement justified continued oppression. Legal frameworks and democratic principles were elaborate theatrical displays designed to disguise what was fundamentally a system of organized predation. "Then we withdraw our recognition of the Council's authority," Sarah announced. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began simultaneous translation demands, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of clicks, whistles, harmonics, and electronic signals. The idea of withdrawing from galactic civilization was simply inconceivable. "Withdrawal from the Council constitutes rejection of civilized society," Ambassador Korthnex declared once order was restored. "Species that choose isolation forfeit all protection and become legitimate targets for any civilization seeking territorial expansion." "We're not choosing isolation," Dr. Keffler replied calmly. "We're establishing alternative frameworks for interspecies cooperation based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical exploitation." The Rigel representative activated a communication display showing economic coordination agreements between the resistant species. "The Coalition of Independent Worlds hereby establishes formal diplomatic and trade relationships outside Council oversight." Prime Counselor Vexhai's crystalline form pulsed with frequencies that overloaded the translation systems, creating moments of feedback static that conveyed raw emotion despite technical interference. When the translation resumed, his voice carried barely controlled rage. "Unauthorized political organization violates fundamental principles of galactic order. The Council cannot permit independent coalitions that threaten established stability." "The Council cannot prevent independent coalitions," Sarah replied with deadly certainty. "Your authority depends on voluntary compliance backed by economic pressure. When multiple species coordinate resistance, your enforcement mechanisms become inadequate." She activated displays showing economic analysis prepared by the Coalition's intelligence services. "Elder species depend on younger civilizations for 73% of raw materials, 46% of manufactured goods, and 91% of agricultural products. Coordinated trade restrictions would create immediate supply shortages." The implications were staggering. The Council's economy had evolved to assume reliable access to resources from subordinate species. They had never developed domestic alternatives because they had never needed them. The elder species had become economically dependent on the younger civilizations they oppressed. "Economic disruption would harm younger species more severely than elder civilizations," the Vorthan representative warned. "You depend on our technology and industrial capacity for survival." "We depend on your technology for convenience," Dr. Keffler corrected. "Independent analysis shows that coalition species possess sufficient technological base for sustainable development outside Council frameworks." Professor Mordun transmitted detailed technical assessments showing how shared resources and coordinated research programs could replace Council technology access within acceptable timeframes. The younger species had been systematically underestimated, their capabilities dismissed as irrelevant to galactic power calculations. "You are making a catastrophic error," Prime Counselor Vexhai stated with frigid certainty. "The Council has maintained galactic stability for over 4 million years. Challenging established order will result in chaos and conflict that threatens all civilized life." Sarah recognized the threat as the last desperate argument of predators facing organized resistance. The elder species had convinced themselves that their dominance was essential for galactic stability, ignoring the possibility that stability might improve when oppression ended. The Council has maintained stability through systematic oppression disguised as benevolent guidance, she replied. True stability requires justice, and justice requires ending your species' predatory exploitation of younger civilizations. We are not predators, Ambassador Korthnex protested. We are guardians of galactic civilization, protecting younger species from the chaos of unlimited expansion and conflict. You are apex predators who have learned to disguise hunting as administration, Dr. Webb interjected, his xenobiology expertise informing his analysis. Your entire system is designed to prevent prey species from developing capabilities that might threaten your dominance. The accusation struck at the heart of the Council's carefully maintained self-image. Elder species genuinely believed they were wise protectors rather than sophisticated parasites, but their behavior patterns revealed the truth about their motivations and methods. The session is concluded, Prime Counselor Vexhai announced abruptly. The Council will deliberate appropriate responses to this unprecedented situation. As representatives began filing out of the chamber, Sarah activated her personal communicator and transmitted a coded message to the Coalition. Phase 1 complete. Council authority challenged successfully. Prepare for Phase 2 implementation. The elder species retreated to emergency consultations, trying to understand how their perfect system of control had suddenly developed critical vulnerabilities. They had spent millions of years perfecting techniques for managing individual species, but they had never prepared for coordinated resistance from multiple civilizations. What they didn't understand was that humanity's predator instincts had awakened something far more dangerous than individual defiance. The human delegation had catalyzed formation of a coalition that combined the technological capabilities, resource networks, and tactical intelligence of dozens of species into a single coordinated resistance movement. The Council was about to discover that evolution never stops, and sometimes the predators become prey with shocking suddenness. The galaxy's power structure was about to change fundamentally, and the species that had dominated for millions of years would learn what it felt like to be hunted by opponents who had learned their weaknesses and prepared accordingly. The real confrontation was about to begin, and the elder species were about to discover that their prey had evolved into something much more dangerous than they had ever imagined possible. The Coalition of Independent Worlds implemented Phase 2 of their resistance strategy exactly 72 hours after withdrawing recognition of Council authority. Across 47 star systems, younger species simultaneously suspended all exports to elder civilizations while activating mutual defense agreements that had been secretly negotiated through academic conferences and scientific collaborations. Admiral Morrison watched the real-time tactical display in Earth's Defense Command Center as the economic disruption cascaded through galactic supply networks. Critical materials shipments stopped moving, manufacturing facilities went offline, and trade routes that had operated for millennia suddenly became empty space. Raw titanium exports from Kepler Federation territories have ceased completely, reported Commander Sarah Kim from the Intelligence Division. The Centauri Alliance has suspended all rare earth mineral shipments, and the Rigel Consortium has activated comprehensive trade embargoes. Dr. Webb joined the briefing via secure transmission from Nexus Station, where he was monitoring Council responses to the unprecedented crisis. The elder species emergency sessions have been running continuously for 3 days. Their logistics networks are experiencing system-wide failures. Admiral Morrison studied supply chain analyses showing the scope of economic interdependence between younger and elder species. The Coalition's intelligence services had identified every critical resource flow, every essential trade relationship, and every vulnerable dependency that centuries of galactic commerce had created. What's their enforcement response so far? 3 hegemony battle cruisers have moved toward human colonies in the Outer Rim, Commander Kim reported. But they're not taking aggressive action. They appear to be conducting reconnaissance rather than preparing for military intervention. The limited military response confirmed the Coalition's strategic assessment. Elder species possessed impressive defensive capabilities, but their expeditionary forces were inadequate for simultaneous operations across multiple sectors. They could threaten individual worlds, but they couldn't project sufficient force to coerce dozens of star systems simultaneously. The Vorthan Empire has attempted to negotiate separate agreements with individual coalition members, Dr. Webb added. They're offering technology transfers and territorial concessions to break coalition unity. Admiral Morrison recognized the divide-and-conquer approach as the Council's standard technique for managing resistance. In previous conflicts, they had successfully isolated resistant species by offering individual incentives that undermined collective action. But the coalition had prepared for exactly this scenario. How are the other species responding to separate negotiation attempts? Complete rejection across the board, Dr. Webb replied with satisfaction. Every coalition member is maintaining unified positions. The elder species can't find any cracks in our coordination. The unified resistance was creating exactly the kind of pressure the coalition had calculated would force fundamental changes in galactic power structures. Elder species found themselves facing economic shortages they had never experienced, while younger civilizations discovered they were far less dependent on Council technology and resources than they had been led to believe. Intelligence reports indicate that the ethereal collective is facing industrial capacity shortages for the first time in over 1,000,000 years, Commander Kim observed. Their manufacturing systems depend on materials that only coalition species produce. Admiral Morrison accessed detailed assessments of how economic disruption was affecting different elder species. The hegemony's military forces were experiencing maintenance problems due to titanium shortages. Vorthan production facilities were shutting down without rare earth minerals. The Zephyrian commercial networks were failing as trade routes became economically unviable. They built their entire civilization around the assumption that younger species would remain permanently subordinate, she realized. Their systems have no redundancy for resistance scenarios. Dr. Webb confirmed the analysis from his position on Nexus Station. The Council's economic models never included variables for coordinated resistance from multiple species. Their planning algorithms are generating error messages because the current situation falls outside all programmed parameters. The Coalition's strategy was working beyond their most optimistic projections. By simultaneously disrupting multiple critical supply networks, they had created a cascading crisis that overwhelmed the elder species' ability to respond effectively. Individual trade embargoes could be circumvented or broken through targeted pressure, but coordinated economic warfare from dozens of species was proving impossible to counter. What about their threat to declare coalition members legitimate targets for territorial expansion? Empty threat, Commander Kim replied after reviewing intelligence assessments. 3 different elder species have territorial disputes with each other, and they can't coordinate military action while their economies are collapsing. Any attempt to attack coalition worlds would trigger defensive responses they're not prepared to handle. Admiral Morrison understood the beautiful irony of the situation. The elder species had spent millions of years preventing younger civilizations from developing military capabilities, but they had also prevented themselves from developing effective expeditionary forces. Their assumption of permanent dominance had left them vulnerable to exactly the kind of coordinated resistance they had never imagined possible. Time for Phase 3, she decided. Phase 3 activated communication networks that had been carefully prepared through months of covert coordination. Ambassador Sarah Chen transmitted simultaneous messages to every younger species in the galaxy, not just coalition members, explaining exactly what the resistance had accomplished and offering membership in an expanded alliance structure. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Species that had suffered under Council oppression for millennia suddenly discovered they were not alone, and they were not helpless. Resistance movements emerged across every sector of galactic civilization as younger species realized that the elder civilization's apparently invincible power was actually quite fragile when challenged systematically. 17 additional species have requested immediate coalition membership, Dr. Webb reported from Nexus Station. Their representatives are offering intelligence, resources, and military cooperation for expanded resistance operations. The coalition's success was triggering exactly the kind of cascade effect that Dr. Webb's xenobiology research had predicted. Once prey species discovered effective resistance techniques, the information spread rapidly through populations that had previously accepted predation as an unavoidable fact of existence. The Council is requesting emergency diplomatic negotiations. Sarah's voice came through secure communication channels. Prime Counselor Vexhai is offering territorial concessions and governance reforms in exchange for resumption of normal trade relationships. Admiral Morrison felt grim satisfaction at the desperate offer. 3 months ago, the Council had dismissed human concerns about colonial evacuation timelines as evidence of administrative incompetence. Now they were offering to negotiate the fundamental structure of galactic civilization rather than face continued economic collapse. What specific concessions are they offering? Full recognition of coalition territorial claims, representation proportional to population rather than civilizational age, and establishment of independent arbitration mechanisms for future disputes, Sarah replied. It's essentially everything we demanded, plus additional guarantees they never offered before. The offers were comprehensive and genuine, representing a complete reversal of policies that had dominated galactic civilization for millions of years. But Admiral Morrison recognized them as desperate measures from predators who had been backed into a corner rather than sincere changes in fundamental attitudes. Their proposals assume we're still willing to operate within Council frameworks, she observed. They don't understand that we've moved beyond reform to replacement. The Coalition's success had demonstrated something more important than the elder species' economic vulnerabilities. It had proven that younger civilizations possessed sufficient technological, economic, and military capabilities to sustain independent galactic civilization without Council oversight or protection. The real question is whether we're ready for Phase 4, Admiral Morrison stated. Phase 4 represented the Coalition's most ambitious objective: complete replacement of Council authority with new frameworks based on democratic principles and mutual cooperation, rather than hierarchical exploitation. It would require establishing entirely new institutional structures while maintaining the economic pressure that had forced elder species to negotiate. Intelligence assessments show that sustained economic pressure for another 6 months will force structural changes in elder species' domestic policies, Commander Kim reported. Their internal political systems are already showing signs of instability as resource shortages create social pressure. Dr. Webb transmitted detailed analysis of how economic disruption was affecting elder species' internal governance. The hegemony is facing worker revolts in their industrial districts. Vorthan regional governors are declaring independence from central authority. The Zephyrian commercial guilds are initiating emergency succession protocols. The implications were staggering. Economic pressure from the Coalition wasn't just forcing diplomatic concessions. It was triggering internal collapse of political systems that had remained stable for millions of years. Elder species had become so dependent on resources from younger civilizations that sustained economic warfare was threatening their basic governmental structures. They're offering to negotiate because they're facing internal revolution, Admiral Morrison realized. They can't maintain domestic stability while fighting external economic pressure simultaneously. Sarah's transmission confirmed the assessment. Council emergency sessions are focusing on internal security rather than coalition response strategies. They're more concerned about preventing their own civilizations from collapsing than they are about restoring their authority over younger species. The Coalition had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had forced apex predator species into defensive positions while positioning themselves to become the dominant force in interstellar civilization. The power structure that had existed for millions of years was inverting with shocking rapidity. Phase 4 implementation begins immediately, Admiral Morrison authorized. Establish the new Galactic Assembly with full democratic representation and equal voting rights for all member species. Within hours, the Coalition began broadcasting constitutional frameworks for replacement galactic institutions. The new structures offered genuine democratic representation, transparent economic relationships, and legal protections that couldn't be circumvented through administrative interpretation. Most importantly, they offered membership to any species willing to accept democratic principles. including elder civilizations that abandoned predatory practices and agreed to operate as equals rather than dominators. The response from younger species was immediate and enthusiastic. Civilizations that had suffered under council oppression for millennia rushed to join organizations that promised genuine representation and protection from exploitation. The response from elder species was more complex. Some rejected the new frameworks entirely and attempted to organize separate resistance to coalition pressure. Others began internal negotiations about whether to accept democratic participation rather than face continued isolation and economic collapse. But the most telling response came from individual members of elder species who contacted coalition representatives directly, requesting asylum and offering to share intelligence about council operations. Millions of years of hierarchical oppression had created internal dissent even among dominant civilizations, and that dissent was finally finding expression. The hegemony's military command is fragmenting, Dr. Webb reported. 3 different factions are emerging, with some officers expressing willingness to cooperate with coalition forces rather than defend the council system. Admiral Morrison watched as the galactic power structure continued its rapid transformation. What had begun as resistance to territorial seizure had evolved into complete replacement of the civilizational framework that had dominated the galaxy for millions of years. The elder species had made one critical error in their assessment of humanity and their younger allies. They had assumed that inexperience with galactic civilization indicated inherent weakness, failing to recognize that newer species might possess advantages that older civilizations had lost. Humanity's predator instincts, combined with the adaptability and technological capabilities of dozens of allied species, had proven more than adequate for hunting the hunters. The coalition had evolved from prey to apex predator in less than a year, demonstrating that galactic dominance was not a permanent condition, but a temporary advantage that could be lost when the environment changed. As reports continued arriving about elder species' internal collapse and younger civilizations' enthusiastic embrace of democratic alternatives, Admiral Morrison realized that the day the Galactic Council saw humanity's predator instincts unleashed would be remembered as the moment when galactic civilization finally evolved beyond the primitive dynamics of predator and prey. The universe was about to discover what truly advanced civilization looked like when it was based on cooperation rather than domination, and the elder species would learn whether they could adapt to a galaxy where their victims had become their equals.